Well, welcome to the 2023 Starker Lecture Series. My name is Tom DeLuca. I'm the Dean of the College of Forestry, and thank you all for being here this evening. Oregon State University in Corvallis, Oregon is located within the traditional homelands of the Marys River or Ampinifu Band of the Kalapuya. Following the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, the Kalapuya people were forcibly removed to reservations in western Oregon. Today, living descendants of these people are part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. The Starker Lectures were established in 1985 by the Starker family to commemorate the lives and personal contributions of TJ and Bruce Starker. These visionary men were in the first graduating class of the College of Forestry. Indeed, TJ was in the first graduating class and went on to become one of the college's early professors. TJ lived what he taught and began purchasing and reforesting cut-over forest lands around Corvallis. In time, these lands became the Starker Forests, a family forest organization that exemplifies the very best there is in private and family forest operations in the state. This year, we commemorate the 38th year of the series. Starker Lectures have challenged our thinking on a wide range of topics from local to global scales. Many have been controversial, generating intense dialogue and debate about our business. All have been stimulating and thought-provoking, exactly what a distinguished lecture series should do. The Starker Lecture Series is organized by a group of dedicated committee members, and one of those long-standing committee members, Brad Withrow Robinson, is here tonight and is retiring, and we'd like to recognize Brad for his dedicated service to OSU. Brad, could you just stand up and be recognized for just a moment? It's really hard when really outstanding people retire, but we get to keep them around. I have seen a number of our Emeritus faculty here today, and they're still very influential and active within the college, so please keep that in mind, Brad. The theme of the 2023 Starker Lecture Series is Innovation in Forestry. Forestry has a long history in innovation amidst challenging physical, social, and economic conditions. Recent and current technological innovations include the use of geospatial analyses, remote sensing tools, and artificial intelligence to improve the outcomes in the woods as well as in mills and construction. As a college, we're actively investing in advanced integration of data streams from forest inventory, mill optimization, and mill output in an effort to address resource sustainability, linking forest stands to the build site. We also make changes in our choices as a community through social innovations. This year, the lectures will look at some historical changes as well as new innovations and technologies and collaborative work. We are really honored to start the series tonight with our first lecture by William Bill Robbins. Bill is an Emeritus Distinguished Professor of History at Oregon State University and author and editor of several books, including Landscapes of Promise and Landscapes of Conflict, The Oregon Story from 1800 to 2000. The People's School, A History of Oregon State University, and A Place of Inquiry, A Place of Wonder, the Andrews Experimental Forest. Born in Connecticut, Robbins served 4 years in the U.S. Navy and then graduated from Western Connecticut University. He later earned his PhD in history from the University of Oregon in 1969. During summers, when he was in graduate school, Robbins worked as a choker setter and foreman of fire crews. He taught at Oregon State University from 1971 to 2002, offering classes in history of the American West, history of the American Indian, environmental history of the United States, and the Pacific Northwest history. With that, let's all welcome Bill Robbins for our first Starker lecture. Bill.
Thank you, Tom. I don't know where to start. First, I want to thank the Starker Forests for sponsoring this series. It's been going on now in its fourth decade, and especially the Starker committee this year, including Brad, for choosing me as the introductory speaker. I know things about innovation in forestry, but most of them are beyond the technological realm. Although the chainsaw and the gasoline-powered yarding machine, I guess, would be part of the machine world of innovation. I do want to say something about T.J. Starker. Before the shutdown, the COVID shutdown, I was on my way to write a biography of T.J. Starker. In March of 2020, when the finding aid came online by the archivists at Oregon State University, the library was shut down. And so it shut down my project, and I don't have the wherewithal today to go and sit in the archives day after day, hour after hour, as I did in doing the Oregon State University history, to do the biography. But anyway, that's my association with T.J. Starker. Plus, I know some of the people who worked for T.J. Starker for the Starker Forests for years and so forth, and one of them will be evident in my discussion. I want to read an opening line about my introduction to Oregon, and that is in the acknowledgments to the first landscapes book, which was published in 1997. This book had its beginnings during my 4-year hitch in the United States Navy. Through the mist and fog of an early October morning in 1955, I hitchhiked north on US Highway 101 and crossed the border into Oregon, courtesy of a friendly, shirt-sleeved log truck operator who preferred driving with the windows open. I was filled with fuzzy notions about tall timber and rivers teeming with fish, and Southern Oregon's coastal mountains appeal to my romantic notions about the Pacific Northwest. And that brings me to 1963, the year I moved to Oregon. Arriving on June 7th, 1963, and then looking for a job. I learned how to set chokers in northwestern Connecticut after I got out of the Navy, and so I was hired on over the phone by a man in Grants Pass, Oregon, who said, "All you have to do is cut the mustard." And my first day in the great Northwest woods was June 28, 1963, a workday like none other that I've experienced in my life. My first day was overcast and gray, lived just off the Oregon Caves Highway, and I climbed aboard a big yellow Chevy pickup and sat between the timber faller and the cat skinner. If you're uninitiated, a cat skinner is one who drives a bulldozer. And we were heading for, as the crow flies, for Big Grayback Mountain, 7,048 feet high. As the crow flies, we were working about 4 miles from the Oregon Caves National Monument. I was hired as a choker setter on an outfit that was building a right-of-way for the Forest Service. This is in 1963, when the Forest Service was in its initial stages of building roads everywhere in the National Forest System. Ernie was the timber faller, the driver of the pickup, and Mo was the cat skinner. These were my work partners that summer. As we turned off the Caves Highway along Big Grayback Creek, there was a morning drizzle, and it turned to rain as we were heading up the hill. And with more elevation, it turned to snow. Climbing still further, we noticed rigs coming back down the hill, a driver telling Ernie that there was too much snow on the ground. Around 40,000 feet of elevation, 4,300 feet of elevation, with an accumulation of about 5 inches of snow, we came to the work site. The cat had 9 20-foot chokers hanging from the hook in the back of the cab. These were half-inch chokers. And those were the equipment that I was going to be following that day. I was working behind a D6 Caterpillar tractor, and Mo, the cat skinner, headed into what I called the scene of action. And I followed, and I was dressed in jeans, a sweatshirt, and crepe soles on my shoes, something that would be disallowed today, of course, with safety regulations. On the first turn, we yarded logs which were visible as white bumps in the snow. And despite slopping through the snow and mud, setting chokers and unhooking logs at the landing, I was cold the entire day. While I was setting chokers, Mo, who was in the cab smoking a cigarette, would climb on the hood of the cab and then put his hands over his butt and lean and bend over the exhaust pipe to warm himself. Although the day seemed to go on interminably, it blessedly ended. And this is what I wrote many years later about that experience. There was no measured pace to my work that day, but rather a frenetic scramble through downed treetops and limbs in search of another log, and then a fast walk to the landing to unhook the haul. As we headed towards the Caves Highway in the steamy, warming cab, I remember little in the way of achievement, only the brutally numbing cold and the churning mud that I mushed through with each turn of logs. Anyway, that was my first day. Welcome, romantic person. 1964, the next year, I worked for the Eastern Lane Forest Protection Association. Again, before the fire season began, we were building another right-of-way for the Forest Service. This one was up the Mackenzie River Highway, close to Mount Hagen. And again, similar experiences, no snow, the weather was nice, and so forth. But on that occasion, I tripled my experiences working with longtime workers who had been in the woods for ages. And that's a whole other story. So the focus of this evening's discussion is going to be the Douglas-fir region. And if you see the map that's on the screen before you, it's identified here as the coastal variety. In other words, the focus of this discussion will be the western slope of the Cascades and the Coast Range. And this is focusing primarily on public forest lands, that is the Bureau of Land Management and primarily the Forest Service. Following the Depression of the 1930s and the Second World War, there was a tremendous pent-up building demand for wooden materials of every kind. Houses in Southern California, which was the primary product for Oregon's, the products from Oregon's mills, literally were going up by the square mile in terms of development. A tremendous building activity going on in the United States. By the 1950s, roughly, let's say 8 to 10 years after the end of the war, mills were beginning to pressure Congress to increase federal harvests because supplies from private lands, timber supplies from private land was decreasing, shrinking. And just in the way of incidentals, I want to indicate that Oregon reached its all-time high in lumber production, all-time high in lumber production in 1955, with 9.1 billion board feet, most of those harvests coming on private land. In the midst of those record harvests, Reed College political science professor Charles McKinley, in a book published in 1952, warned that the huge harvest disrupted streams, destroyed spawning grounds, and raised water temperatures. And I just discovered this line, and I thought, for a non-scientist, for a political scientist, this is very early for a citizen to bring something like this to the public's attention. What he feared, and I'm quoting, was that the post-war boom would obscure the relations between basic resources and a healthy economy. Forest Service and BLM sales soared. The Forest Service adopted a program called conversion. In other words, turning old-growth forests into fast-growing planted forests. Conversion became an article of faith for people knowledgeable about the lumber industry, converting old growth into stands, which are kind of like agricultural models of production. That was the prevailing model of forestry, growing trees faster, using herbicides to kill brush so that the Douglas fir would grow faster. I call this production science. If you try to look at it that way, that might be something to be open to question. During my time in graduate school in the 1960s, the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management raised their harvests, defined clearcutting as scientifically sound, increased the use of chemicals as a management tool to enable the Douglas fir to grow faster. And they experimented with genetically selected super trees. This is what I wrote years later in Landscapes of Conflict. That book was published in 2004. And I quote, "The dramatic production figures from the national forests during those years reflected more a computer-generated fantasy than the actual volume of federal timber." That insight was not part of my thinking in the early 1980s. I had little criticism about the substance of intensive forestry, building roads, and plantation forestry. Industrial leaders, regional politicians, the Forest Service, and so forth believed that all was well and good in the world of forestry, in the world of intensive forestry. Now, what I find interesting about this is that intensive forestry fostered its own opposition by its practices. And we begin with the person of Rachel Carson in her great book, Silent Spring, published in 1962. Rachel Carson and scientists and citizens, others, began to challenge that prevailing system of intensive forestry. And then in addition, you have the beginning of legislation in Congress that comes into focus. The passage of the Wilderness Act in 1964, the National Environmental Policy Act, 1969, and the Environmental Protection Agency, which was under the Environmental Protection Act, the agency was established in 1970. The Clean Water Act, 1972. The Endangered Species Act, 1973. And then a few years later, the National Forest Management Act of 1976, which becomes very important in the future, and I'll come back to that later. What this legislation did was to reflect a growing public concern over environmental harm. Environmental organizations began questioning clearcutting, practices, of course, that were preferred greatly in the Pacific Northwest. Region 6 Forester Charles Connaughton urged in 1970 that foresters should forcefully defend clearcutting, Foresters must, he said, take steps to defend it strongly, intelligently, and aggressively, unquote. There were a few foresters, forest scientists, among them was Jerry Franklin, who raised questions about clearcutting. And this is in 1974, it was an article that I found in the Wall Street Journal, which referred to an article by Jerry Franklin and a colleague providing what the Wall Street Journal called the first major criticism of broad-based clearcutting. Now, here in the Pacific Northwest, opposition to clearcutting, a lot of it was cosmetic. People who were incensed that clear cuts would come down to highways on the way to the coast or on the way into the mountains. I call that cosmetic opposition to clear cutting. There were other controversies that emerged during these years, and that, excuse me, was the use of DDT to control forest pests. And this was after DDT was banned in 1972. There was a clause in the banning of DDT that in cases of emergency, the Forest Service or other agencies could appeal to overcome the act and to use DDT. There was a widespread outbreak of tussock moth in the Malheur and Ochoco National Forests in 1973. And the EPA allowed the Forest Service to use helicopters to spray DDT, and the report was virtually complete mortality of the insect, unquote, quote unquote. In the same year, EPA again granted the Forest Service permission to use DDT. And what's interesting is that in both of these cases, the moth had been declining from diseases in both of these cases. I want to turn now to another, what I call a unique case of science and citizen activism, which took place literally in our backyard in Benton County, when Bonnie Hill, an English and journalism teacher at LC High School, initiated research into the use of the herbicide 2,4,5-T and women in the LC area who had miscarriages. And I want to pause and say Bonnie Hill was a dear friend of mine for more than 50 years. So part of this story is personal, but it's all in print. 2,4-D or 2,4,5-T and 2,4-D, is probably a lot of you know, was used in Vietnam as Agent Orange, subject to lots of criticism globally, and was finally stopped by the U.S. Army in the early 1970s. There was lots of other evidence, scientific evidence, about the dangers of 2,4,5-T. In its production, it produces one of the most toxic chemicals known to man, dioxin. And that is what becomes the foot of a lot of these stories of criticisms. In LC, helicopters had been spraying 2,4,5-T on national forest and BLM land in the spring to keep the brush down, and so that would release the growth of Douglas-fir. In March 1979, the journal Science published news about 8 women in LC who experienced 13 miscarriages between them since 1973. Bonnie Hill gathered maps, the timing of spraying, the proximity of women to the sites before making her preliminary correlations. She also looked into wind conditions, where it's impossible in steep canyons in the Coast Range to not find the wind blowing in one direction or another. The EPA examined the 8 letters submitted by Hill and found it sufficiently convincing to issue a temporary halt to the use of 2,4,5-T and Silvex. That was in January of 1979. EPA followed with the LC2 study involving thousands of miscarriages in the Coast Range, and that resulted in the delisting of 2,4,5-T for public use. That was a huge story in the late 1970s. Any of you who've lived through it understand what I'm referring to. I want to turn now to the other side of the coin, a popular term in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, getting out the cut. In other words, this is the larger story of timber harvests. The Forest Service, prior to the Second World War, had been conducting itself largely as a custodian of the national forests, selling local timber sales, small nature, and so forth and so on. After 1945, all of that changed. Harvests on national forests and BLM lands soared, and I have some figures here that you can see on the screen. 1 billion board feet early in the 1940s, 3 billion board feet by 1952, and more than 12 billion board feet harvested by 1966. That's on national forest and BLM lands. Now, if we look at Willamette National Forest harvests, we see a similar profile. And I've listed here the years 40, 50, 60, and 70, and you can notice the 55.7 million board feet, 1940, increasing by 1970 to 773.6 million board feet of harvests. There were challenges to all of this, to getting out the cut. The most serious, and I remember this well, was the West Virginia chapter of the Isaac Walton League. The West Virginia chapter of the Isaac Walton League brought suit against the Forest Service in a case that was dubbed Isaac Walton League versus Butts. That was a reference to Richard Nixon's Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butts. That case in 1973, the district court declared clear-cutting illegal on the Monongahela National Forest, citing the Organic Act of 1897 for federal forests. Congress quickly got to work to resolve the issue, and 3 years later passed the National Forest Management Act, which, in other words, made clear-cutting in the Pacific Northwest legal. It legitimized clear-cutting. However, as you'll see, there were clauses in the act that would eventually curtail Forest Service sales, references to biological diversity, references to endangered species, and references to public input on Forest Service sales and cutting. Let me turn now to this book, The History of the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest. And if you're like a lot of my colleagues, where is that? And it's stunning to me because I started working on this book after I finished the Oregon State University history, and working with Fred Swanson especially, and doing something about bringing to public notice the wonderful research carried on at the Andrews Experimental Forest, hence the book. The Andrews Forest was established in 1948 as the Blue River Experimental Forest. Its initial studies were focused on efficiently overcoming or converting old growth timber to fast growing young trees. In other words, going back to the old conversion idea. In 1953, the Blue River Forest was renamed the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest in honor of H.J. Andrews, who was the preceptor for the Blue River Forest and who was killed in an automobile accident in Washington, D.C. in 1951. Very interesting person. Renamed the Andrews Forest after that, by 1970s, research on the Andrews began to change, attracting people from different agencies, Oregon State University scientists, faculty from other institutions, and graduate students flocking to the Andrews. And I found a piece by one of the forest managers, Art McKee, in 1983, who tallied up the research going on the Andrews. During the calendar year, 61 academic scientists, 21 agency scientists, and 48 graduate students were operating under more than 50 funding sources. That's in 1983. Since its founding, Andrews scientists have been affiliated with the Pacific Northwest's Research Station, whose main offices are in Portland. A lot of the members of the Research Station, however, were stationed on the Oregon State University campus. Some are probably here in the audience tonight. And they have been very active, in other words, in the H.J. Andrews experimental forest. Relations between the Andrews Forest, the Pacific Northwest Research Station, the College of Forestry here, and the Forest Service ranger districts in the Willamette National Forest and in the Siuslaw National Forests have been quite close, as you'll see. Lots of adaptations of applied science carried out in the national forests in various ways. Andrews' research findings have, in other words, found a receptive audience in managers of the national forests. Since 1980, the Andrews has been affiliated with the National Science Foundation, what's called the LTER program, or the Long-Term Ecological Research Program. And I was kidding Dick Waring, who is sitting here, he was the first principal investigator under the LTER. Am I right, Dick? And the forest has been, I told Dick I didn't have his name in my script, so I do now. The LTER awards were initially for 6 years. These were long-term ecological research programs. That's significant. And that was one of the items that the National Science Foundation, which funds these LTER research programs, because you can conduct research over 1 year, but it doesn't really mean anything when you're dealing with plant, terrestrial, and aquatic environments. LTER awards originally were for 5 years, and in 1996 the grants were lengthened to 6 years. The grants have funded research in terrestrial, stream, atmospheric, and increasingly climate change investigations, among a multitude of other inquiries. The Andrews has become one of the flagship research centers in the United States, renowned globally for people who are interested in ecological research. And it's presently operating on its eighth LTER award. Old growth timber, cutting old growth timber, gained little public notice in the 1980s. And what's striking to me is that the heavy cutting of old growth timber attracted attention in the early 1980s by the Seattle and Portland chapters of the Audubon Society, who were interested in scientific findings about the importance of old growth timber. In 1981, Jerry Franklin and a team of scientists published Ecological Characteristics of Old Growth Douglas-fir Forests. He was one of the researchers, and there were others, some of whom I know, and I'm going to mention their names: Art McKee, Chris Mazer, Fred Swanson, and the late Jim Siddell. And there were 3 or 4 others. What the publication did was to explain the ecology of old growth forests and their significant differences from plantation forests. They were not dead trees, as the industry tried to argue. Old growth forests included and I'm quoting from the book, large live trees, large snags, large logs on the ground, and large logs in streams. Jerry Franklin thought back to his days in forestry school in the early 1950s and his teachings then. And he said what he remembered was old growth forests were biological deserts and cellulose cemeteries. Important to bringing science to public notice, especially regarding old growth timber, was Eric Foresman. His studies of the northern spotted owl, beginning when he was in graduate school in 1969, 1970, continuing through the 1970s until he became the foremost scientist to be consulted about northern spotted owl. What his research revealed was that 95% of spotted owl nests were in old growth coniferous forests, a critical scientific finding that the industry and some of its naysayers were saying that they saw spotted owls on lampposts in the center of Corvallis and elsewhere. I have another section I'm going to begin, and the title is, and this is pathetic, "The Birds Come Home to Roost." In the early 1980s, the Pacific Northwest economy went in the tank and was primarily due to high interest rates, the collapse of the construction industry across the country, and especially in Southern California, which was the market for a lot of Northwest timber. Lots of high unemployment in counties, especially timber-dependent counties across the state. By the middle of the decade, the region's economy was beginning to recover from the recession. And two powerful Oregon politicians, Republican Senator Mark Hatfield and Democratic Congressman Les Aucoin, began amending appropriations bills, ordering the Forest Service to increase federal timber sales. They were seeking increased harvests beyond what many Forest Service supervisors considered unsustainable. And then Hatfield, who was considered an environmental senator, and Washington Senator Brock Adams began attaching riders to appropriations bills, restricting court appeals. That was finally ended. The Senate ended that practice in 1990. Now, what the figures on the screen indicate are the accelerating harvests on the Willamette National Forest in the late 1980s, amid these rising criticisms. And I find this, in retrospect, strange. Increasing timber harvests as lawsuits were circling to shut down Forest Service sales. Willamette National Forest timber sales, you'll see them there from 1984 to 1989. And notice the sales for 1988, 907 million board feet of timber sold. And it continues in 1989, 854 million board feet. Those heavy criticisms unleashed criticisms everywhere in the Oregonian, from foresters and from scientists. Forests were being harvested beyond sustainable rates, a lot of forest supervisors argued. Road building was dividing habitats harmful to fish and wildlife. Fishery scientists were opposed to harvesting timber along streams. Cutting old growth threatened spotted owls. And the National Forest Management Act required the Forest Service to protect indicator species, such as the spotted owl, to maintain healthy ecosystems. And then the hammer fell in May 1991, when Federal District Judge William Dwyer issued an injunction blocking federal timber sales involving the habitat and potential habitat for the spotted owl, until the Forest Service met the requirements of the National Forest Management Act. Dwyer's decision was stunning, and something I just discovered when I read the substance of his decision. The guilty parties, he said, were not scientists, foresters, and rangers at the working level, but, and I quote, decisions made by authorities in the executive branch of government. And I would add Congress. I'm going to go through the period, that's a huge volume of literature, what happens in the wake of Dwyer's decision, because there have been books and huge tomes of studies. Bill Clinton's election as president in 1992 led in April of 1993 to the famous Forest Summit in Portland, Oregon. Out of that agreement, out of that meeting, came the appointment of the Forest Ecosystem Management Assessment Team, or as it's called in the popular literature, the FeMAP report of 1,039 pages of science. The glossary in the FeMAP report, I counted them, were 40 pages. I once had a copy of the FeMAP report, but when I retired, I donated those and boxes of other books to friends of the library. And then in subsequent research, I go to the fairgrounds when they had sales looking to buy those books back. Anyway, the FeMAP, the FeMAP report satisfied no one. It led eventually, of course, to the Northwest Forest Plan going forward. Industry complained that restrictions on harvests were draconian. Environmentalists complained that it allowed too much cutting. And I copied this last week from the Forest Service website. The mission of the Northwest Forest Plan is to adopt coordinated management direction for the lands administered by the USDA Forest Service and USDI Bureau of Land Management, and to adopt complementary approaches by other federal agencies within the range of the northern spotted owl. The management of these lands must meet dual needs, the need for forest habitat and the need for forest products. Both sides in that argument would say that it met neither. Then an item that appeared in National Geographic in June 2021, and this came from an article they picked up from Biological Conservation. The owls' numbers are the lowest on record. Their population declined by somewhere between 50 and 75% since 1995. This is in 2021. And the owl, of course, the barred owl replacing it may be extinct at some point. Now, what about job losses? The Dwyer decision, the industry argued, would cost the region something like 65,000 jobs. The Northwest lost between 1989 and 1995, let's say a 10-year period following the Dwyer decision, 16,000 jobs. And there are other components that you have to remember when you're talking about job losses, because you can't attribute them simply to a court decision. Because in the recovery of the lumber industry, a lot of old sawmills closed, new state-of-the-art computerized mills replaced those, and the reduction in labor in the mills is stunning to me. In Coos Bay, I know there's a couple of examples of computerized mills that emerged in the late 1980s and 1990s. That one mill was like on 3 shifts of operating, Two of them production shifts, one was a maintenance shift, could produce as much lumber with about 120 total employees as the Coos Bay Lumber Company back in its heyday in the 1930s and 1940s could produce in a similar day, and with about 400 workers in the mill environment, not including people on the railroads, on the sloughs, and out in the woods working. Tremendous decline. So let's look at these two slides. Slide number 26, Oregon harvests 1962 to 2018. This is the most graphic representation I could find of the decline in sales on public lands. And you can notice, you see the decline through the 1980s, 1990, it comes close to hitting bottom. And so the blue stripes from, I can't read on the screen, excuse me for a moment. From 1992 and on, they're pretty even. And if you look at the harvests on federal lands from that point on and into the present day, they roughly even off about the same time. They go up and down a little bit. So harvests are very limited. If you move to the next slide, you can hear, these are Oregon timber harvests on both public and private lands between 1990 and 2004. And you can see 1990, 91, 92, 93. This is all forests, in other words, public and private. By 1994, 95, they're down to 4,304,039, 4,081 in 1997. And from the year 2000 through 2020, they range in pretty much the same area of average timber volume produced. So that's the beginning and the end story of the spotted owl in terms of public land harvests, which did decline, as everyone knows, pretty significantly. I want to spend just a moment or two talking about science and forest management. Through the 1980s and 1990s, scientific research on the Andrews affected management on the Willamette National Forest, having to do with the importance of stream vegetation, leaving wood in streams for healthy aquatic life, and wood on the land for nitrogen fixation. And the Willamette National Forest adopted a lot of these innovative strategies. Andrews' investigations that became part of the Willamette National Forest included watershed erosion and especially landslides. And I want to take a moment to recognize, I can find my papers here, an interview papers. This is an interview on Dave Miller's Think Out Loud 2 days ago. An interview that he did with Catalina Segura of our College of Forestry, who's in the Department of Forest Engineering, Forest Resource Management. And what the topic was 70 years of study about landslides on the Andrews Forest. And she told Dave Miller that early landslides were associated with road building, with clear cutting and slash burning. Clear cutting and slash burning removes anything that's can be decomposed naturally in the forest. And these study areas, she points out, were involved in very steep terrain following intensive forestry practices. And the Andrews Forest has also gathered a great deal of information on flood storms, and two of them in 1964 and 1968. You'll see a slide here. The top one is Watershed 3, which is one of the three historic watersheds on the Andrews Experimental Forest, with gauging stations at the mouth of these roads before they cross under the road and dump into Lookout Creek. The top one is December 1964, and you can notice on the road kind of charred timber and so forth. Well, that's probably the leftovers from slash burning, because that area at Watershed 3 was finished harvesting about in the early 1960s. The bottom photo is taken in 1996, huge floods, and the same gauging station blew out again, twice in the same spot, again in 1996 because of the water flow. And this is 22 years, 64, 74, 84, 94, 32 years after the initial flood. So you have new growth, second growth plantations growing there, and all of this occurred. One thing she told Dave Miller was that clear cutting on the Andrews, which was experimental at the time, but it's useful now to study on what happens in the aftermath. That the clear cutting practices ended long ago. And she said that what happens with the new growth that's now being pretty substantial, and another major storm event, it'll be interesting what happens to the forest, what kind of experiences will we see when there is another huge precipitation event, how well the management practices reflect what happens. Very interesting. Other investigations on the Andrews involved water quality, water temperature, the importance of woody debris in streams, and that's dating from the early 1970s. Fred Swanson and others who have conducted investigation. This is just a small sample of the interplay between science and forest management. Let me turn to the 21st century and unprecedented challenges for forests everywhere. The last 2 decades, climate change has presented new and ongoing problems. Rising temperatures, east and west of the Cascades, historic droughts, increasing frequency and intensity of wildfire. And we know today you can add to that floods, heat domes, atmospheric rivers, polar vortexes, and so forth. In the coastal Douglas-fir region that I've been talking about, the most severe effects of fire, of course, have been the Labor Day weekend fires of 2020. Powerful east winds knocked down power lines, igniting new fires and blew small existing fires into raging infernos. And one that comes to mind, all of them do, but Beachy Creek started with a 500-some acre fire in the wilderness area. And I remember listening to the radio on Monday night, September 7th, 2020, and telling my wife, this thing's going to blow up. Within 18 hours, it blew up to over 100,000 acres. And that was just one fire. There was one exception to these fires, and that was the Alameda fire in Talent in Phoenix, Oregon. A fire without a forest, but burning like one, destroying 2,600 homes. The most severe fire in that respect in Oregon history. In the wake of these fires, and I picked up this item in a blog soon afterwards, was a Canadian environmental writer by the name of Ed Struzik, who argued that Oregon's Labor Day fires were a cautionary tale for Western United States. And you can read this on the screen with me. The fires burned more than 1 million acres in Oregon, erupting in places where they rarely burn, and overwhelming firefighters whose tools and strategies are no longer sufficient to deal with this new wildfire paradigm. In California that year, and these are not all the Labor Day weekend fires, Oregon fires burned 1 million acres, California 4 million acres. And a fire scientist, Matt Riley, I don't know if Matt is here this evening, he's with the PNW Research Station, told me that before the Labor Day fires, Oregon had experienced a relatively mild fire season. 2021, which was a much more active fire season, he told me that if those kinds of wind events occurred in 2021, the acreage would have been way, way more than 1 million acres. So that's something to keep in mind. It's sort of expect the unexpected, which is one of my favorite mantras. Those powerful east winds are interesting. Fires usually burn up, right? Because heat rises and it's the natural way. I went to fire school when I was foreman of fire crews, and we were always told that fires burn up, especially during the daytime. These powerful east winds blew down Oregon's western valleys, in their wake dropping humidity to single digits. The fires burned on private and public land alike, with equal forest, on planted and natural forests. In other words, the fires were indiscriminate. Ted Sickinger of the Oregonian warned that the Labor Day weekend fires were a wake-up call for Western Oregon. Given the unpredictable climatic conditions at our present moment in time, my guess is that we probably can expect more of the same. This image is from the summer of 1967. It's on a ridge at the top of a small fire, ignited along Highway 126, just below Blue River, where the cliffs go up. Somebody threw a cigarette out and went up the cliffs into the forest. My crew from Mosby Creek, outside of Cottage Grove, drove there with our tanker, and we joined the crew from Springfield to fight the fire. And it was kind of exciting. It was a big fire. We got out of the fire camp and so forth. And I don't know how many acres it burned, maybe 10. Put that in the context of the Holiday Farm fire, 173,000 acres. Our thing was aflame. And I'm going to end partially with the last note, the last sentence in a fire article I wrote, published in the Oregon Historical Society on the first anniversary of the Labor Day weekend fires. Nearly 6 decades after my first trek into the Western Cascades, the effects of global warming provide powerful evidence that fires are now burning more often and in places where they seldom burned before. And I want to add one final note. When I first began learning about climate change and realizing what might be happening to places that I frequented beyond my lifetime, and I thought about my grandchildren. Climate change is on steroids. It's happening in my lifetime and yours. I thank you very much.
So if we have questions, if we could bring up the floor lights, that might be, or the seating lights. Any questions?
Yeah, I've heard that overall.
Here, let me come down and try.
Okay.
Yes.
My name's Chris Folk. I worked in the Forest Service over about 23 years and saw a lot of forest fires. It's been said that fire suppression, firefighting activities may have very little effect on the overall acreage and intensity of forest burn. Has there been any studies or observational or whatever done on that?
Yeah. Fire suppression, of course, if you talk to a lot of environmentalists, was the great boogeyman, setting up now forest conditions which burn like hell because there's so much brush around and things of that sort. And I'm not saying there's no credibility to that. That's true. But the industry uses that argument that we need to log more. In the wake of climate change, I'm not sure that old firefighting techniques matter anymore. I mean, Ed Struzek put his finger on it. You have fire flames that blow a mile from the point of fire ignition and set new fires and new fires beyond that. And old strategies, building fire breaks and so forth, are out the window. There are ways of protecting homes, obviously, by making a defensible space, having gutters that are covered and all of this. But that's one of the perils that we faced at the present. I'm not sure I answered your question, Chris, but.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Also, the effect of the land, the contour of the land, and the fuel conditions.
All right.
Okay. Go here first and then Dick.
Okay. Thank you. I have a question over here. Yeah, I was wondering, you mentioned that the clear cutting and the use of chemicals and all that was based on scientific concepts. And now we're saying that's not really scientific, proper science. How do people decide what to believe?
That's a great question. I gave it a name, production science. And that was my qualification. In other words, it was a science that followed the practices in the field. And that was before we understood and there was any public credibility to what we now know as ecosystem science. The value of old trees, that old trees were not old stands of old growth and so forth, were actually had more life in them than plantations and so forth and so on. So I think it's a difference of time. Science, as Anthony Fauci says, is important, and it changes. And that's something that people still don't understand when they listen to Anthony Fauci, because they'll pick on something he said 3 years ago about the coronavirus and say, see, he's a dummy, he didn't know anything. But science is a progressive thing, and certainly what we understand today about the function and the importance of forest environments, as carbon sequestration places, and all of this is something that goes way beyond anything we understood 30 or 40 years ago. I look at myself, in the 1960s, those plantations are wonderful places to go out and cut a Christmas tree. And also to hunt deer, because you can see them, and so forth and so on. And anyway, different world. Yes.
Dick Waring, the question that I have is looking to the future. Do you think that logging sales will be only on fire-scarred dead trees in the future? Because if it is, that's actually hitting an ecosystem when it's down.
Yes.
And that's a whole new set of research.
Thank you. You can see why he was the first PI of the LTER, because he knows the details. There's been some harvests, select cutting on federal forests, and you see that thin blue line all the way across from the 90s into the 21st century. So there will be cuts. And the Northwest Forest Plan, initially designed, had a component to do experimental cutting. And that has been stopped by lawsuits and so forth. So the Northwest Forest Plan, in other words, in terms of its initial drafting, has never been functionally practiced, I think. But Dick's right. One of the great problems with some of the places that are covered by the Northwest Forest Plan have been devastated by fires. And, what do we do with the dead and dying trees? It's difficult to surpass lawsuits to log in those areas, especially on public lands I'm referring to. And even in the wake of the Labor Day weekend fires, the cutting of timber along Highway 22, along Highway 126, and the highway, the one that goes up the Umpqua River, 38 or something like that. There was a lot of criticism about the harvest of trees along those highways, even when they were threats to populations. Did I answer your question, Dick?
Yeah, that's good enough.
I struggled. Yes.
I've got a question about your numbers about the cutting in the Willamette National Forest. I noticed that you presented it in board feet rather than acres. And I'm wondering, was the reason that there was such a decline due to the fact that most of the largest trees had already been removed, or because fewer acres were being cut?
Yeah. Most of the old growth was cut, except for old growth that's in the wilderness system and the existing old growth on the Andrews Experimental Forest. By the way, that's 15,800 acres on the Andrews. I don't think I mentioned that. So, yeah, there's a lot of places now where trees are getting old, but they don't qualify in any scientific way for being old growth. Let's say if a place was harvested in the 1950s, and now you have a great stand of what people in the industry would call commercial timber and so forth, that is aging in place. Timber that the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management at that point in time thought would be harvested today in the wake of all of these changes in the world of science.
Yes, very nice talk. When you talked about the development, you focused on the politics, the big picture up there. Can you comment on the history of, the populace, of people like us driving it in our value choices as consumers, buying houses that are bigger and bigger and stuff? What happened there? What was the role of those, and how did those changes over time influence the forestry?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. For everyday people living in urban environments or suburban environments, the campgrounds in the national forests become very popular after the Second World War. There is a proliferation of campgrounds, both in the national forests and in Bureau of Land Management lands, that still are existing today. Some of them have closed because of lack of attention, lack of resources to keep the campgrounds up, because the agencies argue that we don't have any money because we're not cutting timber anymore to keep the campgrounds in order. But certainly the campgrounds are important. The forests have been important to people for a variety of reasons. In other words, and I think of Eric Foresman. A critical writer has said that people like Eric Foresman and Jerry Franklin were products of the New Left administrations, the New Left movement of the 1960s, which is a bunch of baloney. Jerry Franklin's middle name is Forest. He went with his family camping in the forests of southwestern Washington with his parents on weekends and so forth. And Eric Foresman grew up in a family in Eugene whose mother was a birder. And so when he got out of the military and started at graduate school, he became interested in the northern spotted owl. So there's a variety of, I could look at myself, and my family and the places that we traveled, certainly when my older sons were young, driving through cut-off timberlands, and their complaints that, it was hot in the car, and I would tell them that there was a Dairy Queen right around the corner. But for a variety of reasons, I think, there's a plethora of reasons. Unless you worked in a mill and you listened to the arguments from that side of the angle, then you joined the yellow ribbon parades and so forth, which were popular in the years 1988, 1989, 90, 91, when groups of log trucks would drive from Philomath to Missoula, Montana to engage in great rallyings. So, yes.
Okay, we're going to have time for just one more question, and we're going to wrap things up. So we have one right here.
Thank you very much, Bill. As you reflect on the policy environment that has produced the results that we have today, that you've been talking about, I'm wondering what advice or what insight you have for the policy environment of today and tomorrow to help untangle kind of the forestry world that we're in right now.
Well, I think the most urgent issue is climate change. I don't think anything else comes close to resolving what happens in forests, public or private, because fires will burn. Heat domes, if they repeat, will be equally catastrophic. East winds, which come off the eastern deserts and plummet down our river valleys and drive humidity into the single digits, will continue. And as you know, I hope you all know, the train is traveling fast, the climate change train. Okay, I want to thank everyone for coming.